Imagine you're there, the port of Southampton, April 10th, 1912. A crowd gathers to watch the departure of the largest, most luxurious, and most promising ship ever built. In the air, a mix of excitement, pride, and awe. The newspapers couldn't stop repeating it. The Titanic is unsinkable. In the distance, the masts cut through the cloudy sky. The massive bow rises like a promise of progress. And you, like thousands of others, are about to board what some called man's triumph over nature. But the Titanic was much more than a ship. It was the symbol of an entire era, the Belle Époque, a time of rapid technological advances and almost blind optimism. Wireless telegraphs, electric lights, transcontinental trains, towering cities, everything seemed to point toward a shining future. And in that context, the Titanic emerged as the perfect synthesis of power, technology, and elegance. Almost 270 meters long, weighing over 50,000 tons, and equipped with cutting-edge technology for its time. With its 16 watertight compartments, engineers claimed that even if 2 or 3 flooded, the ship would remain afloat. The most repeated phrase in the press? Practically unsinkable. First class was a world of its own. Carved oak staircases, reading rooms inspired by the Palace of Versailles, 10-course dinners with French menus. There was even a swimming pool, a gym, and a Turkish bath. A floating city for the elite of the world, businessmen, aristocrats, bankers, and celebrities. But the lower decks told another story. Third class traveled with the hope of a better future in America. They were workers, farmers, entire families. For many, it was their first time leaving home. Their cabins were small, shared, without luxuries. And although their tickets cost just a fraction of a first-class fare, for them it was everything they had. Now fast forward to April 14th, 1912, 4 days after departure. It's night. The sky is perfectly clear. The stars shine so brightly they seem to reflect on the ocean. No moon, no wind, just an icy silence surrounding the ship. The waters of the North Atlantic are near freezing, 0 degrees or below. Inside the Titanic, life goes on. In first class, some enjoy a drink after dinner. In third, families are already asleep. The musicians play in the lounge. No one imagines the fate that's approaching. At 11:40 p.m. it happens. The impact. A groan. A long muffled scrape, almost imperceptible. The iceberg wasn't spotted in time. The damage. 6 compartments torn open. The Titanic was doomed. But this is where the contrast begins. Because the movie we all know, while brilliantly dramatized, condensed, and crafted with cinematic mastery, also leaves out crucial fragments of the real story, the harsh details, the human decisions, the structural inequalities. Did you know, for example, that some crew members thought it was just a scare, that several ice warnings were ignored out of overconfidence, and that most third-class passengers didn't even know how to reach the upper decks until it was already too late? The story of the Titanic is also the story of a divided society, and the ship, with its hierarchical decks, restricted corridors, and unspoken rules, was a floating mirror of the world that built it. More than an unexpected tragedy, the sinking of the Titanic was the outcome of a system, one that trusted too much in technology and too little in shared humanity. And have you ever wondered whether the Titanic was a victim of chance or of collective arrogance disguised as progress? Don't answer just yet, because the most revealing part comes now. Now that you've seen what the Titanic represented in its time, it's time to face an uncomfortable question. How much of what we saw in the movie actually happened? What was real, and what was an emotional reconstruction for the big screen? Come with me, because we're about to break down, one by one, the most iconic scenes in cinema, to uncover the truths hidden in the name of spectacle. We're diving into the heart of the cinematic myth, and what you discover might make you see the Titanic with new eyes. Perhaps one of the reasons the Titanic lives on in the memory of millions is because of Jack and Rose, a poor artist, a young woman trapped in a life of appearances, an impossible love blooming in the middle of disaster. The story is unforgettable, but it's also fictional. Jack Dawson and Rose DeWitt Buccatere never existed, and though their names are engraved in popular culture, their faces aren't on the Titanic's passenger lists. They never boarded the ship. They never embraced at the bow. They never sank together into the icy waters. So, why invent a love story in the middle of a real tragedy? Do you think it was necessary to create romance to keep us emotionally invested? James Cameron, the film's director, explained that Jack and Rose were a narrative vehicle, a way to connect the story to a modern audience, an emotional gateway into the Titanic's universe. And it's true, without them, maybe many would never have cared about this chapter of history. But in doing so, there was a risk of overshadowing the real people who were actually there, because the Titanic wasn't just a stage for fiction, it was the final chapter in the lives of more than 1,500 people, and many of them lived stories far more powerful than any screenplay. Think of Thomas Andrews, the Titanic's chief engineer. The film portrays him as noble and calm, helping until the very end, and that's true to the accounts. Survivors described him walking the corridors, handing out life vests, guiding passengers. He knew the ship was doomed and chose not to abandon anyone. Or Molly Brown, the unsinkable, a millionaire who, against every class stereotype, helped women aboard, demanded to go back for survivors, and confronted the lifeboat officer, a real woman, flesh and blood, who didn't need a love story to stand out. And then there's Bruce Ismay, director of the White Star Line, a complex figure. He survived the disaster but was condemned for not giving up his seat in the lifeboats. The movie paints him as a coward, almost a villain, but reality is murkier. He helped load passengers and only boarded when there were no women or children left in that section. Was it selfishness or instinct for survival? History isn't as black and white as cinema often makes it seem. One of the most sensitive cases, however, was that of First Officer William Murdoch. The movie shows him accepting a bribe and taking his own life in a moment of despair. But historical records tell a different story. Murdoch played a key role in trying to avoid the iceberg, helped direct the lifeboat evacuation, and according to multiple witnesses, died trying to save others. His family protested after the movie's release. Years later, James Cameron issued a public apology, and this raises an uncomfortable question. To what extent can artistic license rewrite memory? When a film reaches millions, when a scene becomes iconic, doesn't it also carry a historical responsibility? It's not about demanding that fiction become documentary, but it is about remembering that behind every real name, there was a life, a story, a family that deserved truth. And did you know about these real people from the Titanic? If any of these stories surprised or moved you, give this video a like and help us keep giving voice to the memories still waiting to be heard. Now that we've explored the real people and the ones born from cinema, it's time to go even deeper. What really happened during the sinking? Which of the most intense dramatic scenes were faithful to reality and which were softened, adapted, or completely changed? Get ready, because we're about to relive, minute by minute, the critical moments of the Titanic, comparing what truly happened with what we saw on screen, and what you discover may not be what you expected. They say cinema has the right to imagine, but when a story is based on a real event, what's left out matters just as much. The version that millions saw on screen was spectacular, yes, emotional, epic, but it also left out essential details that, far from diminishing its beauty, would have given it even more truth. Let's start with the sinking itself. James Cameron's film shows the ship breaking dramatically in two, people falling, explosions, chaos. But on the real night of April 15, 1912, time was a silent enemy. The Titanic didn't tilt as quickly or as sharply as it seems on screen. The tragedy was slower and far more agonizing. The engineers on board, for instance, stayed in the engine room until the end, keeping the power running and the pumps working. They didn't flee, they didn't scream, they didn't panic. They have no scene in the movie, but their silence was heroic. And the officers, some, like Fifth Officer Harold Lowe, not only filled lifeboats amid chaos, he later returned to the freezing waters to rescue those still alive among the wreckage. Few dared to do that. Lowe did. In the movie, it's barely hinted at. Then there's one of the hardest truths, the third-class passengers. The film briefly shows families searching for blocked exits, trapped behind barriers that kept them from the upper decks. But in reality, the differences between social classes were far starker and deadlier. Over 60% of first-class passengers survived. In third class, 3 out of 4 died. Can you imagine dying simply because you couldn't afford a more expensive ticket? It wasn't just confusion or panic. Several official reports later revealed that some exits were kept closed for precious minutes, that the emergency wasn't communicated quickly to the lower decks, and that not everyone had the same priority when the crisis began. And there's an even heavier silence. The movie almost completely avoids talking about racialized passengers. On board were people of Syrian, Chinese, Indian, and Filipino origin, many of whose stories were erased for decades. For example, the 6 Chinese passengers on the Titanic, only 2 survived. When they reached New York, they weren't welcomed. They were deported immediately under immigration laws of the time. None of that appears on screen, nor does the film dwell on what happened after the sinking. For days, bodies floated adrift. The ship CS Mackay Bennett was sent to recover what it could. It found hundreds. Many were buried at sea, others in Halifax, Canada. Some remain unidentified to this day. Imagine being a family member of someone on that voyage and watching their story transformed or erased by spectacle. If you've made it this far, you've already crossed the halfway point of this journey, and that's no small thing. Show it in the comments with the phrase, "I'm on board too." That's how we'll know who's truly living this story and not just watching it pass by. Is this changing the way you see the Titanic?
Was there something you didn't know that struck you? Tell me below, I want to read your thoughts. And if stories like this move you, subscribe to Cronoearth and turn on the bell, because there's still so much more to uncover, and this is only the beginning. Sometimes, artistic license hides necessary truths, and the problem isn't embellishing the story, it's forgetting what made it real. Maybe, if we listened more to what wasn't shown, we'd understand why the Titanic wasn't just a maritime tragedy, but also a mirror of the inequalities of its time. Because behind every scene that was never filmed, there's a story still waiting to be told. What you're about to see isn't just about ships or ice, it's about decisions, about real people, about what happens when power, pride, and fear collide in the dark, and every second lost carries irreversible consequences. No ship sinks for one reason alone, and no tragedy happens because of a single mistake. What occurred that frozen night wasn't only the result of an iceberg, it was the outcome of a chain of human decisions. Some miscalculated, others simply ignored. Imagine being there. The SS Californian was just 20 kilometers away from the Titanic, close enough to have arrived before the end, but the Californian's radio operator had gone to sleep. Just minutes before the distress calls began, they saw lights on the horizon, even white flares tearing through the darkness, but no one understood their meaning. No one acted. In the movie this is barely mentioned, but in reality, the inaction of Captain Stanley Lord left a haunting question that still echoes today. What if they had responded? Now think about the Titanic's speed. Despite multiple warnings about ice in the area, the ship was moving at near full throttle. At least 6 iceberg warnings were received that very day. But the pressure to stay on schedule, the pride of an era obsessed with progress, and the belief in its own invincibility meant no one slowed down. ChatGPT+, and the lifeboats, only 20 for more than 2,200 people. Not because no one realized more were needed. Thomas Andrews, the ship's chief engineer, asked for them, but the regulations didn't require it, and visually, the extra boats spoiled the ship's appearance, so they weren't added. Then there's the captain, Edward J. Smith, one of the most respected men of his time. This was meant to be his final voyage before retirement. And some historians believe that his desire for a flawless farewell, a trip without delays or complications, outweighed his instinct for caution. None of this was truly shown on screen, because to do so would mean breaking the myth and revealing something far more uncomfortable, the imperfect humanity behind a real tragedy. And once you understand that, everything changes. The Titanic didn't sink only because of ice. It also sank because of overconfidence, delayed decisions, and a blind faith in progress. Sometimes, it's not the iceberg that sinks a ship, it's everything that pushes it to keep going, without stopping in time. Now get ready, because in the next part, we'll leave the surface behind and descend together into the depths, where history isn't told with words, but with rusted iron, darkness, and fragments that still whisper what truly happened. What you're about to see wasn't reconstructed, it was found. The Titanic was a ship, it was a tragedy, it was a lesson, but with time, it became something more, a symbol, a myth, a story told and retold until it became almost legend, and much of that transformation happened in a movie theater, because James Cameron's film didn't just revive interest in the Titanic, it redefined it. It turned it into an emotional phenomenon that transcended generations. Hundreds of millions cried for its story. They fell in love with Jack. They rebelled with Rose. They sang "My Heart Will Go On" as if it were part of their own memory, and in a way, it is. Cinema has that power to make a story feel like it belongs to us, even if we never lived it. Film can touch hearts, yes, but it can also erase nuance. And when we talk about memory, that matters, because we risk remembering more of what we saw than what really was. The real Titanic was a collective event, more than 1,500 lives lost. Men, women, children, entire families. People of all ages, nations, and backgrounds. Yet when most people think of the Titanic, the first image that comes to mind isn't human tragedy, but a love scene at the bow, 2 arms stretched into the wind, an iconic phrase, "I'm the king of the world." And you know what? That scene is beautiful, but it wasn't in the Atlantic that night. It wasn't part of the frozen silence or the true terror that hundreds experienced. Cinema gave us an emotional gateway, but it also built an edited memory, and that's why we're here. Because remembering isn't just about revisiting what moves us, it's about having the courage to face what unsettles us, what was omitted, what was transformed, what became spectacle, when in truth it was pain, confusion, and pure humanity. Take a moment to reflect. How many other tragedies have been told through the lens of entertainment, and how many real memories have been buried under the shadow of a well-written scene? Memory needs art, yes, but it also needs truth, and when both come together with respect, they can illuminate the past instead of replacing it. Keep watching, because what comes next goes beyond the screen, beyond myths, beyond romance. We're going to look directly at how cinema shapes what we believe, how we remember, and who we choose not to forget.
When a film manages to move millions of people around the world, something changes. For decades, the story of the Titanic was known mainly by historians, families of victims, and ocean researchers. But thanks to cinema, that story reached millions who otherwise would never have stopped to look. That is power. The film reignited interest in underwater archaeology, multiplied visits to Titanic museums, inspired books, documentaries, new research, and even encouraged scientific missions to the depths of the Atlantic to study the wreck before it disappears forever. And that's something we can't ignore. Art, when created with passion and sensitivity, can become a bridge to truth. But that bridge can also have cracks, because while it gave visibility to a story, it also cemented myths. Scenes that never happened, characters that never existed, relationships created purely for the script. And if we don't add context, if we don't dig deeper, if we don't look beyond the screen, fiction runs the risk of replacing reality. That's why it matters that you're here today, because what you're doing right now, you still watching this video, listening to this story, is more than just consuming content. You're recovering a memory, you're taking a moment to think, you're looking at the past with new eyes. Cinema can open the door, but we are the ones who decide what to do once we cross it. And when we remember the Titanic, we have an opportunity to honor the truth, to give space to the voices that never got a happy ending or a place in the credits. Because this story, like so many others, deserves more than applause. It deserves to be understood and told again and again, without forgetting where it truly came from. More than 1,500 people died that night, and not one of them was a secondary character. They weren't numbers. They weren't just names on a list. They were real lives, with stories that deserve to be told with respect, not just represented with emotion. Today, we've sailed together between what cinema showed and what it chose not to show, between legend and memory. And if you've made it this far, to the end of this journey, it's because something inside you wants to look at history with different eyes, not as a sequence of scenes, but as a mirror that still reflects who we are. Because the Titanic wasn't just a tragedy, it was a reflection of its time, and perhaps also, of the world we still live in today. If this story moved you, if something you saw today made you think, write it in the comments with the phrase, "History stays aboard." Do you know another real story that cinema hasn't told properly? Leave it in the comments too. This channel is also your voice, and if you haven't already, subscribe to Cronoearth and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Because history hasn't ended, it's just changed course. See you on the next voyage.